Dames en heren, ladies and gentlemen, baie dankie vir hierdie fantastiese uitnodiging na die SAOU in this extremely dynamic industry of education. It's an enormous privilege to spend some time with this industry and indeed with the leaders in this industry. I spend my life working with typically senior leaders in typically large organizations, helping these senior executives to think about what's possible, what's probable, what the implications might be for their own institutions. And that has significant implications for the kind and quality of decision-making as all of us shape the future. Thank you very much for this invitation. I'll share some thoughts with you, and as we go along, I'll give, of course, a personal view, and I look forward, of course, to the views that you yourself might have. Ek is uitgenooi om te praat oor hierdie fascinerende onderwerp, die nuwe normaal. Wat impliseer dit werklik, the new normal? What is the real implication? And I'm going to share just some of the trends that I'm observing with regards to this. One of the key important first steps, I'd say, if we want to discuss the new normal, is to reflect on, well, what is the normal in the first place? How would we define such a thing? Has anyone ever seen it? I think would be an interesting question to pose. One way of thinking about normal is that it is what we associate with usual. In other words, what typically happens, the standard patterns of occurrence, if you like. Also very much the expected state. You can see the foresight, the anticipatory dimension there. There's what we expect to be the state of play, what we expect to be the condition. And of course, it's natural to see why this should be such an important topic, because what all of us experience here is, of course, for most of us, not at all what we expected. I think if you're being hypercritical of the education industry, you could argue that it's one of the few industries where if you left the planet 1,000 years ago and you landed here on Earth again today, it's one of the few industries that you might recognize. And so perhaps one could argue that normal is part of the problem in the education sector. Of course, that's just one perspective, as I mentioned in my introduction. One of the things I think we could ask is, if we have a sense that there's a new normal, can we reflect a little bit on just the nature of the old normal? Is it perhaps a picture like this from ancient Greece, with some wide person in the front of the room, humble, eager students, well-disciplined, recording their learnings as they go along? Notice, just tongue-in-cheek, the presence of tablets there, those in that case made of wax, of course. But one way to think about this is, what was the old normal? So if we're anticipating some sort of new normal, is it just a sense of frustration with the perturbation, the changes that we're all experiencing? Or is there a clear separation to be made between what we thought the old normal was and what we now expect the new normal might be? Another interesting question to me as we reflect on this is, did anyone think, as we reflect on the old normal, that that was in fact normal? I can't ever once remember having heard someone more than 2 years ago reflecting on the education system and thinking, well, this is just normal. This is just what we're expecting. This is the usual state of affairs. So I am, in these very introductory thoughts, just inviting us to reflect on what we mean by the state of play, the normal expectation, what the new normal might be. We can discuss what the nature of the old normal was. I think we can debate. Have we ever had a sense of normality? Many would say perhaps not in the last few years. Can we then argue that we are at a stage where we are ready to welcome each other into the so-called new normal? And so if the past wasn't exactly what we might describe as normal, perhaps the best we can do is now to welcome each other to the new abnormal. In other words, a clear differentiation from what we've become accustomed to from patterns of the past might be one option. to think about what we could be expecting and what might be the implications for a complex system like education. I would say that we are not quite ready yet, not as institutions, but I mean, given the shift that we're experiencing, to defend the argument that we are currently in the new normal. We are not even in the new abnormal. I would suggest to you, learned colleagues, that our experience is something like crossing a bridge of understanding. We are still very much in the turmoil of the change. And I think many of us are experiencing that. And the dust has by far not settled. We are in the very heart of the disturbance at the moment, the eye of the storm, if you like. And that has the disadvantage, of course, of creating enormous disruption. But, and this is important as a thesis for my presentation to you today, that disruption creates a loosening of formerly very fixed bonds, and that loosening of bonds creates the opportunity for alternative systems. And those opportunities will be accessed in very interesting ways by those who are starting to enter the new world of education. So not quite yet, I would argue, the new normal, very much crossing that bridge of understanding, paying close attention to the dramatic and rapid changes around us. But of course, on the other side of that bridge, may be something interesting for all of us to find. Some of you may know that it's been just over a decade now since my own first edition of this book of mine, Systemic Leadership Learning, in which I really argued for an entire reinvention of the way that we think, particularly of leadership education at all sectors and levels of the education system, the idea of leadership development in the era of complexity, even hypercomplexity. And one of the main theses in that book was the idea that perhaps there's an opportunity for us to move beyond curriculum centricity and continuity. Now, I know this is a terribly sensitive matter, but I would argue that as the education system came under pressure, just like many other systems, it reverted to one of its core fundamentals. And that is, there's stuff to be taught. And in fact, when you listen to most experts, you will hear that they measure the level of progress in the year essentially based on the percentage of the curriculum that has been completed. Now, of course, that's a reasonable metric system, but I think we should interrogate that with a little bit more discernment and wonder whether, for example, ancient civilizations, when they were faced with a problem, whether the curriculum was really the most significant thing they worried about as they thought about the future of their own civilization. Did ancient civilizations stop learning, in other words, when they were hit by crises? And when we reflect on it like that, I think that introduces an interesting question about whether curriculum centricity and indeed curriculum continuity should be the major focus as we try to grapple with this crisis. Those ancient civilizations, I would suggest to you, had a different, more agile way of conceiving of what it means to learn, what an education may mean. And I think we need to ask some new questions, particularly with the democratization of content and knowledge, on whether, in fact, the curriculum-centric response to the crisis is the best possible way of dealing with it. Now, in healthy societies, there's a fundamental principle in healthy social systems of so-called requisite variety. In other words, essential diversity. And here I don't mean sort of simplistic racial diversity. I mean something quite beyond that idea. really a spectrum of diversity that is essential for multiple perspectives. And that's important for network stability. If you look at the sustainability of societies throughout history, those that have been the best connected, think about the trade centers in the history of the world, have indeed been the most sustainable. And so part of my thesis to you here today is to think on the extent to which we have that requisite variety, that spectrum of diversity, essential for multiple perspectives in the education system, that gives us a kind of network stability for greater sustainability. What's the quality of our networks here? What's the quality of our networks? And what does that mean for the quality of our futures as a system? Well, one way to think about this is something that in future science we refer to as exospection. Put very simply, it's what you might call the Cremora Effect. Now, perhaps for the younger people in the room, in the 1980s, there's a very famous advert. A gentleman goes to the fridge. He's looking for the milk. He can't find it. He gets frustrated, often the sign of a low intellect. He asks the consultant in the bedroom, where is the milk? She's frustrated. You can hear it in her voice. And she tells him, of course, it's not inside. It's on top. It's not inside. It's on top. You can hear the frustration in her voice. He continues to search. She realizes he's not the brightest pin in the packet. It ends in divorce. They don't show the whole movie. But the point is, it's not inside. Now, if we apply this principle in the study of innovation, what we often see in the future of systems is that the innovation is not inside. It doesn't come from the inside. It comes from the outside. The disruption typically arises from the outside. If we apply that principle to the education system, what can we expect? Well, I would say one of the things that we should reflect on is the set of conditions that are currently presenting the perfect storm for an enormous trend all across education, and that is the partial or complete privatization of education. I say all across the system because I think the clear lines between so-called private and public education are about to be blurred dramatically. What are these characteristics that make South Africa such a perfect storm for such privatization? Well, the first thing I would suggest there is that we have a weak state capacity, and that results in a poor quality of the current offering in many cases, with very many notable exceptions. The second characteristic of this perfect storm here is a significant fiscal constraints. You know better than I do the vast percentage that South Africa spends on education as a percentage of its GDP compared with its peers all around the world, and the comparative benefits that we're getting. And that fiscal condition, of course, is exacerbated by severe and growing debt. There are perceptions of low ethics. We can debate whether that's the case or not, but low ethics often opens a breeding ground for dramatic change. We do have a constitutional democracy with vast guarantees of freedom. That is a substantial attraction for those who are interested in private investment. There is a sophisticated business sector, which certainly increases the probability of the participation of the business sector in the economy. There are freedoms that are ensconced in the Constitution, including academic freedom, always, of course, having to be done ethically, and media freedom. And so you can see the perfect storm that's starting to be built here on how the future of the system may be disrupted. In addition, there's a highly turbulent higher education sector. You can just see how the turbulence is loosening the bonds of the traditional system. There's an enormously high level of unemployment. Just a few days ago, we heard the staggering news from Statistics SA. There are vastly underserved needs. And then finally, education remains a central societal value. Whether all teachers can see that every day in the classroom remains to be seen. But a perfect storm, therefore, being created for the disruption of the education system by an increasing number of diversified private players in the system. And that, I reiterate, will be not only relevant for private education, but will disrupt the public offering currently available as the mix of education on offer starts to change dramatically. As a result, what we can expect is a holistic competitive strategy in the rapid privatization of education. And I'll share in the next few moments just some of the dimensions of that competitiveness strategy. One of the interesting thoughts to me is the extent to which public offerings, state-owned government schools, will reposition themselves in order to compete in their communities with this increasingly growing and diversified spectrum of private offerings. Now, in the pursuit of this idea, I then produced, which some of you will have seen in the media, the so-called unique selling proposition for schools as we enter a new era of competitiveness, what some might say hyper-competitiveness. Let me spend just a moment on each one of these dimensions. The first there, of course, is the intellectual domain, but you can see I've deliberately not referred to this as the academic domain, because I think increasingly what will happen is that the world of the academic domain, with an erstwhile definition centered typically around access to knowledge, in a democratization of knowledge dispensation, will make a dramatic shift to intellectual development. That's not the same as learning and remembering things. Intellectual development, of course, you know better than I do as educators, is the entire gamut of intellectual functioning, including, of course, some of the so-called 4 or 5 C's, 21st century skills, and will increasingly, I believe, expand to mental abilities, to conceive of the mind holistically beyond a kind of memory or basic interpretation tool. Just for interest, with some colleagues in the private sector, I've been developing this idea of the mindset index, a way of indexing mindsets and the implications that might have for the future of learning. In addition then to that intellectual mental domain, I think for as long as we have societies, we can expect that the ability to think with others and work with others to reach consensus on social norms will increasingly become an important competitive dimension of a school offering. That personal, social, cultural domain, I think it's important here that this will move far beyond the ability to just play with others and get along and work in a team. It will move to very complex, I think, dimensions of education that position students in hyper-competitive schools for a globalized socialization, far beyond the sort of, we often think of South Africa as some special little country with such diversity. I mean, Dubai alone has over 195 nationalities. The entire ability to engage globally, I think, is going to become increasingly important in cultural and social education, as is the intrapersonal management ability, that ability to manage oneself. Increasingly important, I think, as new players enter the education realm. Of course, physical dimensions of education will remain important, but here I'm thinking far beyond phys ed and, you know, sports on a Saturday. I'm thinking really about thinking holistically about the physical realities of the students in our care. And those students, of course, will become increasingly diverse and global, especially in privatized environments. A holistic perspective of the physical dimension, and that includes also physical self-management, as well as the growing body of science on the interaction between the physical and the mental. And these, of course, we know presents a holistic view of education. You've all learned that at university. But here, particularly, I'm referring to the emerging sciences on how the mind influences the body and the implications that that might have for managing my own body. I think one of the things COVID's done is really placed an enormous emphasis on the way that we think about physiology and what that means for how we relate to others, what it means for our own mental well-being. There, I think, is a whole wealth of opportunity for new providers that will have an alternative perspective that goes far beyond, as I said, phys ed and sports on a Saturday. One of the interesting dimensions here is I think we can expect a major focus on by private players on so-called professional education. It's a big debate on where this would sit. Different countries around the world have different philosophies here. In South Africa, in many cases, there have been calls for some schools to become much more oriented towards the job market. We all know the dilemmas around unemployment in South Africa and the debate around the role that schools should and could play in that environment. I think when we look at private players entering the market, we can expect them to offer employability as one of the key unique selling propositions, key significant differentiators in their offerings in the education market. That professional domain. There was a time when that was just the world of kind of technical education. I think new providers in the market will have employability at the forefront of their holistic offering. In addition to that, education will almost inevitably compete on infrastructure. But here I don't mean fancy rugby fields with floodlights for the games on Friday night. I mean a shift dramatically to digital infrastructure. And here I don't mean, you know, online learning limited to the idea of a laptop pointed at a whiteboard and calling that online learning. I mean a comprehensive strategy by schools who offer a competitive offering to the market with an integrated digital infrastructure system. Obviously, that's going to cost an awful lot of money, but I think those prices are coming down, and those schools who still think of infrastructure as rugby fields will have to rethink the way I think they position themselves in the hyper-competitive future. In addition to all of those key dimensions, because we're talking about increasingly private education, I think that new normal will have a tremendous focus on the brand of that educational institution. That will become increasingly important as the tangibility of the educational institution reduces with digitization. And so brand becomes an enormously important dimension. This used to be the preserve of a handful of private institutions, but I think as we move into increased privatization, we can expect a spectrum of brands to emerge, and those brands will be built around quality and indeed trust that what our children will be exposed to there will be something that will make them competitive in the broader society. And then finally, I think as the world becomes increasingly complex and diverse and globalized, we might see the emergence here of ideology as a potential differentiator between schools. It was Winston Churchill in the time of great global ideological conflict who suggested that the empires of the future will be the empires of the mind. I think in the hyper-competitiveness that we can expect in education, an articulate presentation of educational ideology may very well be one of the unique selling propositions that schools have to offer. And so when we bring it all together, we have this unique selling proposition model as one possible future as we interrogate the landscape of the potential new normal that we might face. A shift from academic to mental and intellectual competencies, a shift in physical education to include mind-body interaction, as I'm oversimplifying things, a shift simply from working with others to a much more globalized, multicultural, in a global sense, type environment, working across borders. A dramatic rise, I think, in the offering around professional education, supported on a foundation of tremendous requirements for digital infrastructure. All of this positioned as a powerful, attractive brand within an overall educational philosophy or ideology. We are indeed in interesting and exciting times. I think as the bonds of the past start to be loosened by the disruption, of course, it presents some threats, but some of those threats are only real threats if we want to hang on to a model that perhaps has reached a point in some environments where it is in fact no longer viable. We should be cautious, not simply to hang on to a model because it's been the tradition. By that, I don't mean that tradition should somehow be challenged. In fact, even as futurists, we place an enormous emphasis on the value of the past, thinking particularly about origins, patterns, attitudes, traditions, cultures, and habits, and how they could serve the future. But we are facing a disruption. Rather than having a psychological and intellectual freeze response in the hope that the old normal might return, let us interrogate with discernment, with a somber mind, the possibilities that we now face as our exciting sector is entering this era of disruption and new opportunity. I want to say, ladies and gentlemen, dames en here, baie dankie vir hierdie fantastiese uitnodiging. Ek sien uit na julle eie opinies, and I'm looking forward to learn from all of you, I hope, as you respond to my thoughts today. Thank you once again, and all the very best with your conference.